When did you first become interested in flying?
When I was a little boy, and I heard about Lindbergh flying an airplane across the Atlantic Ocean.
Did you want to do that when you heard about it?
Yeah, my father took me down to the Washington Monument grounds to watch Lindbergh when he was staying there with a lot of the people from Washington, the mayor in Washington, several other people were all standing on a platform, and my father took me down to see them, and he would give a speech. And my father put me on his shoulders, and we were sitting on the grass. I mean, he was standing on the grass, and they were about a football field away from us. And he pointed out to me and said, "There's Lindbergh." And I looked down there, and there were 4 or 5 men on this platform, and I didn't know who was Lindbergh. But it was just fun being there.
What kind of airplanes did they have when you were a little boy?
Monoplanes, that's, an airplane with 1 wing. And they had airplanes with 2 wings, similar to the airplanes that flew in World War I.
When you were a little boy, did you imagine satellites going to space or flying to the moon?
No, because there were no such things as satellites. There was no such thing as a space program. Nobody even thought about that at that time.
How did you become qualified to work for NASA?
Well, I had gone to college and become an aeronautical engineer. I got a job at the Naval Air Test Center at Patuxent River, Maryland, where I was involved and assigned to conduct tests of naval airplanes for catapult launches and arrested landings. I worked at the Bureau of Aeronautics, and then I worked at the Naval Ordnance Laboratory, where I worked on guided missile warheads, explosives. And then I went to work for NASA at Goddard Space Flight Center. The first one I worked for was called the S-6. It was a round satellite of about 36 inches in diameter, of which this is a little model of it. It had various sensors on it to measure atmospheric conditions in space, just at low altitude in space.
What was the hardest project you worked on in the space program?
The hardest part was the International Ultraviolet Explorer. It was abbreviated IUE. And it was international because the United States was going to make some parts of it, England was going to make some parts of it, France was going to make some parts of it, and several other countries in Europe were all going to contribute some parts. The French were going to build the solar array. The English were going to build the TV cameras that had to go in there behind the telescope to send the pictures back to Earth. The French were going to build the solar array. The English were going to build the TV cameras that had to go in there behind the telescope to send the pictures back to Earth by radio. And so it was an international project. People in the United States and in Europe were going to build all these different parts. They'd come to the United States and put together. Scientists wanted to put a telescope into space that would be able to be above the atmosphere and fly around the Earth at very high altitude where there would be no air, and it would not be contaminated by the air, and it could get better optical data from that altitude. So I designed the structure of the satellite, and I designed the design shape of the solar array, which had to fit around the satellite and be able to fold outward after it got into orbit and rotate in a direction so that it would always have some part of the solar array pointing at the sun, even though the mirror, the telescope, would be pointing all various directions in the sky. We had it transported down to the Kennedy Space Center, where it was put on a launch vehicle and launched into orbit into a very, very high altitude.
What was your proudest moment in the space program?
My proudest moment in the space program, I guess, was when the IUE got into orbit successfully. I was very glad when the thing got into orbit, and so was everybody else at the Goddard Space Flight Center. And it was originally planned for 5 years, and that was the hope. The satellite actually lasted 18 years, and it had to be turned off. They had to send up a radio signal to turn it off at the end of 18 years. By the time 18 years had gone by, the Hubble Telescope was coming along, which is a much, much bigger telescope. It would be carried up to space in the space shuttle. Picture of a design that I made in a study project of whether they should do this mission to send a satellite up to Jupiter and Saturn. And I was assigned to design the structure. And so I designed this structure of that satellite. It would go out to Jupiter and Saturn, and they call it the Outer Planets Explorer. So they have a big dish antenna for the radio, and they have long booms to hold these reactors to provide the heat for the battery. The heat, they would generate electricity. You have to have electric power for the satellite. If it's going to go out to Jupiter and Saturn, it's not going to be able to get sunlight to generate battery power. They had to be remotely from these things here that are going to be scientific instruments, so that they had to have these very long booms on them to get them out away from the thermoelectric generators. And then it had to have a great big dish antenna to be able to send radio signals for so many millions of miles away back to the Earth. And all the other people designed the interior, all the instruments had to go inside. And we sent that report to NASA headquarters for them to review it and then decide whether they wanted to do the mission and whether they had enough money to pay for it. And they finally decided and got approval from the government to spend enough money to do that project, and they designed a spacecraft similar to this, but much more elaborate. That was actually one that flew out there to the outer spacecraft, the Voyager project. So I designed this thing which enabled them to decide to do that project. I worked on the Hubble Space Telescope with regard to the guide rails for the axial scientific instruments. And these were instruments that were a little bit smaller than a telephone booth. They had to be slid into the places in the satellite. There were 4 of these, and they were optical instruments. Had to be precisely lined, but they had to be capable of being removed when it's in orbit. I could take the whole Hubble Space Telescope and put it in a shuttle bay of a space shuttle. The astronauts could then open it up and pull one of these satellites out, pull one of these scientific instruments out, and put a new one in place. So they had to have guide rails, and I worked on those guide rails.
Are any of your projects still operational in space today?
Voyager is currently 11.1 billion miles away from Earth. This year, Hubble completed the Extreme Deep Field Image of the Universe, which reveals an image of the universe from 13.2 billion years ago. When my great-grandfather was my age, he couldn't imagine satellites or traveling to the moon. The images from his work are part of my imagination and the imagination of many others. Today, I can't imagine a world that can only fly as high as the clouds.